Welcome to Audiobook 365 Stories.
Lucille and Yvette Saywell were sisters. When Lucille was 9 years old and Yvette was 7, a shocking thing happened in their family. Their mother, Cynthia, left their father and ran away with a young, poor man. The sisters' father, Arthur Saywell, was a vicar. He was a handsome man and a good husband. The vicar's neighbours were very surprised. Why had the vicar's wife left him? Lucille and Yvette did not know why their mother had gone away. Perhaps she did not love them. Perhaps they had not been good daughters. The vicar was offered a job as rector of Papelwick, a small village in the north of England. So the family went to live in the rectory, which stood just outside the village. The rectory was an ugly stone house, with the river Papel running just beside it. The rector's mother and his sister, Aunt Sissy, came to live with the rector and his 2 daughters. The rector's mother, or Granny, as the girls called her, was over 70 years old. The rector was very upset that his wife had left, so Granny never spoke about Cynthia to her son. But secretly, the old woman was pleased that Cynthia had run away. Granny was now the most important person in the house. She controlled everybody else, so that they did what she wanted. She liked controlling the family very much. If Cynthia came back, everything would change, and Granny did not want that to happen. Lucille and Yvette remembered their first home in the south very clearly. They also remembered their mother. She had been like the sun. She was beautiful and bright, but also dangerous. She had brought light and life to the house, but she had also been selfish. As Granny grew older, she became almost blind. She could not read, and somebody had to lead her about because she could see very little. She did not get out of her bed until midday, but she controlled all the other people in the house. The rector especially loved his younger daughter, Yvette. Yvette was like her mother in many ways. She was beautiful, but careless. The rector spoiled Yvette, and he let her do everything that she wanted. So, as Yvette grew up, she did not care very much about other people's feelings. The rector's sister, Aunt Sissy, was almost 50. She spent all her time taking care of Granny. Sissy did not complain, but inside she felt angry. She had no life of her own and no future. She had no time for herself, and she had nothing to look forward to. Yvette was young and beautiful. She never tried to understand Aunt Sissy's feelings, so Aunt Sissy was jealous of Yvette and hated her. When they had finished their education in England, Lucille and Yvette were sent to a school in Switzerland for a year. They returned to the rectory at Papelwick when Lucille was 21 and Yvette was 19. They were tall, attractive young girls with fresh, bright faces. Their hair was cut short, in the modern style. It was a summer day, and Yvette and Lucille were coming back to England. They were crossing the Channel by boat from France. The girls were not looking forward to living at the rectory.
Papelwick is such a boring place, said Yvette. There are no interesting young men living near the village.
Yes, there are, said Lucille. The Framley family lives in the village, and Bob Framley is a nice young man. And you know that Jerry Summercoats adores you.
But men who adore me are very boring, said Yvette. I would like to fall deeply in love.
I wouldn't, said Lucille. I would hate to fall in love. Perhaps you would hate it too if it happened.
But won't
Don't you hate to go back to Papplewick? Said Yvette. Not really, said Lucille. But I suppose that we'll get rather bored there. I wish that Daddy would buy a car. We'll have to ride our bicycles everywhere. As the ship came closer to the south coast of England, Yvette and Lucille watched the cliffs of Dover. The walls of rock were usually white when the sun shone. But today, the sky was grey and dull, and the cliffs were grey and dull too. The two girls looked tall and confident, but they were just young girls who knew nothing about life. They were like ships that were moving from a safe harbour onto the wide and dangerous sea. As soon as they went inside the rectory, Lucille and Yvette felt depressed. The hard stone walls seemed ugly and unclean. The furniture seemed ugly and unclean too. Nothing was fresh. The food they ate was terrible. Granny was given special things to eat, and grey-faced Aunt Sissy ate very little, only one boiled potato at dinner. She never ate meat. Sissy hated food and eating. Granny was now over 80 years old. It was easy for her to control her son. When Arthur Saywell's marriage went wrong, he had realized that life outside the family could be difficult and dangerous. Only life inside the family was safe. So he stayed close to the family and his mother, the most important person in the house. The countryside round the village of Papplewick was dark and dull, with steep hills and deep, narrow valleys. All the houses in the village were made of stone. Life in Papplewick was as dull as stone, too. Lucille got a job in the city as a secretary. She travelled to and from the city every day by train. Both girls helped the poorer people in the village. But Yvette left the rectory whenever she could. Sometimes she had tea with the wives of men who worked in the factories. She liked talking to the working men. Their world was very different from her own life in the rectory. The months passed. Yvette went to lots of parties and dances. Sometimes friends came in their cars and took her to the city. But she never seemed to be really happy. At home, she was often angry, and she was rude to Aunt Sissy. The girls hated inviting their friends to the rectory. There were only 4 rooms downstairs: the kitchen, the dining room, the rector's study, and the drawing room. The drawing room was the only room where a good hot fire was lit, so Granny always sat in the drawing room. Whenever the girls brought their friends to the rectory, Granny was sitting in the drawing room. The girls never felt comfortable, and they could not relax when Granny was there. Granny liked meeting people. She wanted to be introduced to all the girls' friends. She wanted to know who the young people were. She wanted to know where they came from and every detail of their lives. When Granny had this information, she took control of the conversation. One afternoon, Lottie, Ella, and Bob Framley, some of Yvette's friends, came to the house. A young man called Leo Wetherell came too. Granny had not met Leo before, so Yvette had to introduce him to her. "Granny, this is Mr. Wetherell."
Mr. What did you say?
shouted Granny.
You must excuse me, I'm a little deaf. I can't hear properly.
She held her hand towards Leo Wetherell and stared at him with her blind old eyes. Leo felt very uncomfortable. "We want to go on a picnic tomorrow," said Ella. "We're going to Bonsall Head in Leo's car." There was a wonderful view from the top of Bonsall Head. From this high hill, you could see across the countryside for miles around.
Did you say Bonsall Head?
Asked Granny.
Yes.
There was a silence.
Did you say that you were going in a car?
Asked Granny.
Yes,
said Yvette.
in Mr. Wetherell's car.
I hope that he's a good driver, said Granny. The road to Bonsall Head is very dangerous.
Leo is a very good driver, said Yvette.
Not a very good driver, said Granny.
He is a very good driver, shouted Yvette.
Then Aunt Sissy came into the room. Following her was the maid, who brought tea and a plate of little cakes. Several minutes later, Lucille returned from her job in the town. She was very tired and had black marks under her eyes. When she saw all the people in the drawing room, she gave a little cry of surprise.
You've never spoken about Mr. Wetherell to me, have you, Lucille?
Said Granny. I don't remember, said Lucille.
You can't have talked about him, said Granny. I've never heard his name before.
Yvette was eating the little cakes. Without thinking about anyone else, she took another cake from the plate. Aunt Sissy felt very angry with Yvette. She picked up her own plate, which had one small cake on it, and offered it to Yvette. Would you like my cake, too? She asked, in a voice that was polite, but cold with anger.
Oh, thanks,
said Yvette carelessly, taking Aunt Sissy's cake as well. Now she had 2 cakes on her plate. Aunt Sissy's face showed her feelings of hate. But Yvette did not notice that anything was wrong. Lucille and Yvette felt very tired when their friends left. The conversation between their friends and Granny had been very difficult. Yvette looked at her grandmother. Granny looked like a kind, weak old lady, but she was very strong. She wanted to control other people by knowing everything about their lives. She was like a fat old toad that Yvette had seen in the garden one day. The toad had sat by a beehive. It had caught and eaten the bees as they came out of the hive. Next day, the weather was dull and grey. The roads were wet and slippery because it had rained for several weeks. But the young people still wanted to drive up to Bonsall Head. There were 2 men in the group, Leo Wetherell and Bob Framley. And there were 4 girls, Lottie and Ella Framley, who were sisters, and Lucille and Yvette. The young people all got into Leo's car. As he drove through the quiet villages, they all talked and sang songs. The car went along the road through dark trees and then began the long, slow climb up to Bonsall Head. At the top of the hill, there were no trees. There was only grass. On each side of the road, there were low walls made of stone. Above the hills, the sky was dull and grey. "Shall we stay here for a moment?" said Leo, stopping the car.
Oh, yes,
cried the girls. Leo turned off the engine, and they all got out of the car. The view from the top of the head was wonderful. All around they could see hills and deep valleys, and towards the north they saw a train moving slowly in the distance. "Come on," said Leo. "Let's drive down to Amberdale and have some tea." The friends got back into the car and drove along the top of the head. They were so high that it was like being on top of the world. Up here, it was cold and windy. The young people were silent, looking out across the stone walls. Suddenly, ahead of them on the road, they saw a horse pulling a small green cart. The cart was driven by a man, and an old woman was walking by its side. Because the road was narrow, the car could not pass. Leo sounded the horn sharply, and the man on the cart looked round. But the old woman walked on, and did not turn her head. Yvette's heart gave a jump. The man on the cart was a gypsy. He wore a dark green cap and a big red and yellow silk handkerchief around his neck. He sat on the cart in a comfortable, relaxed way. "Get out of the way!" shouted Leo angrily. The man pulled the horse's reins and the cart stopped. But it was still in the middle of the road, and the car could not pass. So Leo had to stop the car too. "Would the pretty young ladies like to have their fortunes told?" said the gypsy, laughing. "Would they like to know what will happen to them in the future?" The gypsy was very handsome, with black hair and a black moustache above very white teeth. His dark, watchful eyes looked at Yvette's soft young face. She looked into his eyes and felt a strange feeling of excitement. It was like a little flame in her heart. "He's very strong," she thought. "He's stronger than I am." "Oh, yes!" cried the girls. "Let's have our fortunes told." "But what about the time?" cried Leo. "It's getting late." "It doesn't matter about the time," said Lucille. The gypsy jumped down lightly from the cart. He seemed a little over 30 years old, and he was well dressed. Beneath his black and green coat, he wore a dark green jumper, tight black trousers, and black boots.